You know, some books you just read, but others you really experience them. And then there are a very rare few that are journeys in and of themselves. Carl Jung's Liber Novus, or as we know it, the Red Book, is definitely one of those. This isn't some diary or a dry scientific log. Oh no. It is the meticulous, handcrafted record of a perilous and totally voluntary descent into the deepest parts of the human psyche, a direct confrontation with the soul itself. So let's open the pages and see what we find. And the journey really begins right here with this single, beautifully illuminated letter D. But it's so much more than just a pretty decoration. You can think of it like a Hindu seed symbol. This one image contains the entire work. If you look, you can see the world of light and reason up on the surface, right? But then below that waterline, that's where the mysterious creatures of the depths begin to stir. It perfectly sets up the whole premise of the book, that dangerous descent into the hidden world and the even harder return back to the light. So you have to ask yourself, why would a man like Jung, a respected scientist, undertake such a dangerous inner journey? Well, to get that, you have to look at the world around him, and more importantly, the world inside him. It was a time of huge personal crisis. He had just gone through this incredibly painful split with his mentor, Sigmund Freud, and the massive shadow of World War I was looming over all of Europe. His outer world was completely fracturing, and that forced him to confront this profound, aching emptiness he felt within. I mean, can you imagine the weight of that realization? Here's Jung, a successful, well-respected psychiatrist. He'd built his entire life on scientific principles and rational thought. But he suddenly sees that this very success, this carefully built persona, it was just a lifeless shell. He felt like his soul was literally starving. So the challenge facing him was just monumental. How on earth can he find his way back to it? He started to frame this crisis as a conflict between two opposing forces. On one side, you had the spirit of this time, that's the modern secular world, obsessed with facts, science, and practical value. And on the other side, the spirit of the depths, that's the timeless inner world of imagination, myth, and deep, deep meaning. To save himself, Jung knew he had to deliberately turn away from the first and answer the call of the second. Okay, but how do you navigate a world that has no map? The tools of science and logic he was so used to, they were completely useless in the realm of the soul. He needed a brand new method, a way to consciously engage with this torrent of images and figures that were starting to flood his mind. And this led him to develop a truly groundbreaking practice. He called this method active imagination. And let me be clear, this is not passive daydreaming or just letting your mind wander, not by a long shot. It's a disciplined, courageous, and deeply intentional practice. It means treating the figures from your imagination not as just fantasies, but as autonomous, psychologically real beings that you can have a genuine conversation with. And the process itself was actually pretty structured. So first, he would deliberately turn all of his attention inward, away from the outside world. Then he would just allow these images and fantasies to come up, and he would engage them directly, ask them questions, let them speak through him, and crucially, he documented everything, every single conversation, every vision, first in what he called his black books, and then he carefully transcribed it all into the Great Red Book itself. So who did he actually meet in this inner world? Well, they weren't just fleeting shadows. He met powerful archetypical figures, and two of the most central ones were an old wise prophet and a young blind maiden. These weren't just personal fantasies, you see. They were figures bubbling up from the collective unconscious, personifications of the great psychic opposites that he desperately needed to understand and ultimately integrate. The first major figure to emerge was Elijah, an old man with a white beard. He was what ancient traditions would call a psychopomp, which literally means a guide for the soul, kind of like a ferryman for the psyche's underworld. This was the archetype of the wise old man, and Jung was totally shocked at first. He tried to rationalize him away as just a memory of his father, who had been a clergyman. But Elijah wasn't alone. With him was Salome, a beautiful young girl. But here's the thing, she was blind. Jung was deeply disturbed by this pairing. I mean, an ancient prophet and a biblical seductress. It didn't make sense. But Elijah simply assured him that they had been together since eternity. So what did these figures actually represent? Well, Jung eventually came to see Elijah as the personification of logos, the archetype of insight, discrimination, and judgment.
Salome, on the other hand, represented eros, the principle of relation, feeling, and movement. And her blindness was absolutely key. It symbolized that this feeling principle was totally unconscious in him, and really in the masculine world at large. The tension between them? That was the central conflict he had to resolve to become whole.
You have to understand, this confrontation with the unconscious was terrifying. The sheer power of these visions threatened to overwhelm him, to pull him right into a state of psychosis. He even admitted later that his fear of going mad wasn't entirely misplaced. He needed a container, a kind of secret space to hold these chaotic experiences without being completely shattered by them. And he found that container in the simple act of drawing a circle. Every single morning, he would sketch a circular image, a mandala, just to reflect whatever his inner state was that day. This wasn't just some art therapy. It was a vital psychological tool. The act of creating the circle, of imposing order onto a page, literally held his psyche together during its most fragmented and dangerous moments. And through this practice, Jung made one of his core discoveries. The mandala wasn't something he was imposing on his psyche, but something that was arising naturally from the psyche itself. He realized it is the archetype of wholeness, the psyche's own spontaneous attempt to create order out of chaos and to represent the total self. The symbolism he found inside these circles was just incredibly deep. Where two circles intersected, they formed a shape he called the vesica piscis, which he saw as a kind of womb of chaos, the generative source from which all patterns are born. He would depict things like philosophical eggs, which are ancient symbols for the birth of a complete spiritual inner self. And often, right at the very center, you'd see a red cross, as if to sanctify the image and ground its immense power. Each mandala became its own little microcosm of creation.
For 16 years, Jung worked to contain and understand these experiences. And then, much later, he found it. He found a historical parallel, a symbolic language that perfectly described his entire inner journey. He found it in the strange esoteric diagrams and mystical texts of medieval alchemy.
He realized the alchemists weren't just trying to turn physical lead into gold. They were using the language of chemistry to describe a psychological process, the transformation of the self. The prima materia, the chaotic raw material they talked about, was his own flood of visions. And the alchemical work was the process of turning the psychological lead into the gold of his most important theories, the theories of individuation and the collective unconscious. The great stages of the alchemical work mapped perfectly onto his experience. The nigredo, or the blackening, that was his initial descent into the terrifying dark night of the soul. The albedo, or whitening, was the purification, that dawning of understanding that came through his dialogues with figures like Elijah and Salome. And finally, the rubedo, the reddening, which is symbolized by the Red Book itself, was the final union, the marriage of the conscious and the unconscious. This ancient alchemical saying just powerfully captures the goal of the entire process. See, it's not about one side winning. It's not about logos conquering eros, or consciousness dominating the unconscious. It's about their complete union. The Red King and the White Queen have to join together. The goal is to bring the passion and fire of life into clear consciousness, and at the same time to illuminate that dark unconscious feeling with insight. In the end, Jung's journey into what really looked like madness became the bedrock of his entire life's work. By having the courage to face the chaos within and the discipline to give it form, he created a sanctuary for his own soul and a map for others to follow. And that really leaves us with a question, doesn't it? What primordial images, what psychic opposites are waiting in our own depths for a conscious dialogue?